Far out in the cold, dark space, far beyond the quiet edge of the Milky Way, the Krill Empire was on the move. The Krill were not known for peace. Nope, not even close. For hundreds of years they had ruled large parts of the galaxy. Planet after planet had fallen under their power. Their war fleets were huge, their weapons were deadly, and most civilizations didn't even try to fight back. When the Krill showed up, most worlds simply waved the white flag. It was just easier that way, and now the Krill had found a new target, a small blue planet orbiting a yellow star, Earth. At first, the Krill scouts didn't think much of it. The planet looked peaceful, too peaceful. No giant orbital cannons, no massive fleets floating in space, no giant battle stations, just satellites, space stations, and a few small ships flying around like busy bees. To the Krill commanders, it looked kinda pathetic. Inside the massive flagship Dominator, High Admiral Vrax stood in the command chamber, staring at the holographic image of Earth floating in the air. The blue oceans shimmered softly, white clouds slowly moved across the planet. It looked calm, way too calm. A young Krill officer stepped forward. "Admiral," he said carefully, "our scouts confirm the reports. Humans have no large military fleet in this system." Vrax raised one eyebrow. "No fleet?" he asked. "None that we can see." Another officer chuckled. "Well, that's awkward for them." A few alien commanders laughed. Vrax crossed his arms and studied the planet. "So this is humanity," he muttered. The Krill Empire had heard about humans before, a young species, new to space, not very powerful yet. Sure, humans were spreading across nearby systems, building colonies and stations, but compared to the big galactic powers, they were rookies, total newbies. Vrax shook his head slowly. "This will be the easiest conquest we've had all year," he said. Another officer grinned. "Yeah, boss, this looks like a walk in the park." Moments later, alarms began echoing across the Krill fleet. Not danger alarms, jump alarms. Thousands of Krill warships prepared to exit hyperspace, huge battleships, heavy cruisers, missile carriers, strike. Frigates, an entire invasion fleet. The Dominator led the formation like a giant shark moving through dark water. Then suddenly, flash. Space rippled and twisted. One by one, the Krill ships dropped out of hyperspace near Earth. Within seconds, thousands of massive warships filled the sky. From Earth, people looked up and saw something terrifying. Dark shapes covered the stars. Huge alien ships hovered above the planet. Like floating mountains, cities across Earth erupted into panic. People ran through the streets. Phones buzzed nonstop. News channels went crazy. What the heck are those things? Are we under attack? Is this real life right now? Governments across the world scrambled to respond. Military leaders rushed into war rooms. Satellites zoomed in on the alien fleet. And what they saw made everyone's stomach drop. The ships were enormous, way bigger than anything humans had ever built. Inside the Dominator, Admiral Vrax watched the chaos on Earth's communication networks. Humans were broadcasting everywhere, news reporters shouting, military officers yelling orders, civilians panicking. Vrax chuckled. "Wow," he said. "They're freaking out already." Another commander laughed. "Yeah, these humans look shook." A communications officer stepped forward. "Admiral, should we send the surrender message?" Vrax nodded. "Yeah, let's get this over with." Moments later, a powerful signal blasted toward Earth. Every TV, every satellite, every military station, the alien message appeared everywhere. A deep mechanical voice echoed across the planet. "Attention, inhabitants of Earth." People everywhere froze. Cars stopped. Airplanes changed course. Millions of humans stared at their screens. The voice continued. "You are now under the authority of the Krill Empire." Inside the Dominator, alien officers watched the reactions with amusement. "This planet now belongs to us," the message said calmly. "Surrender immediately, and you will be allowed to live." Silence filled the room. Back on Earth, the response was strange. No answer came. No surrender message. Nothing. The alien officers looked confused. One of them tilted his head. Did they hear us? The communications officer checked his console. Oh, yeah, they definitely heard us. Vrax frowned slightly. So why aren't they answering? Minutes passed. Still no reply. One of the younger officers shrugged. Maybe they're arguing about it. Another laughed. Yeah, humans probably can't decide who's in charge. More laughter filled the command room. To the Krill, the situation seemed simple. Earth had no fleet, no defenses, no chance. It was game over. Vrax waved his hand casually. Give them 10 minutes, he said. Then we begin planetary occupation. Outside the command window, the alien fleet slowly spread around Earth like a giant metal cage. Thousands of weapons pointed toward the small blue world. Everything looked under control. Everything looked easy, but far away. Beyond the orbit of the moon, deep in the dark silence of space. Something moved. Something huge. At first, it looked like shadows drifting through space. Then the shadows grew larger, much larger. Strange signals suddenly appeared on Krill scanners. Inside the Dominator, a sensor operator blinked in confusion. Admiral? Vrax didn't turn around. What is it? I'm detecting objects approaching the system. How many? The operator hesitated. A lot. Vrax finally turned. Define a lot. The operator swallowed. Well, sir, that's the weird part. The holographic screen zoomed out. Dozens of massive shapes appeared near the edge of the system. Then more appeared. Then more. The officer's voice dropped. They're really big. Another scanner officer leaned forward. Wait, what the heck? The objects were moving slowly, but they were enormous, much bigger than normal ships. Vrax stared at the screen. For the first time since arriving, his confident smile faded just a little. Identify them, he ordered. The sensors struggled to scan the objects. Energy readings climbed higher and higher. Weapon signatures appeared. Huge weapon signatures. The operator whispered quietly. Sir, I think those are ships. Another officer scoffed. No way. Nothing that big exists. But the shapes kept coming closer and closer. Finally, the first object drifted into the light of the distant star. The entire command room went silent. The ship was gigantic. Its armored hull stretched for miles. Massive railguns lined its surface. Blue energy lines glowed across its metal body. One officer whispered under his breath. Holy crap. Another said quietly, That's not a ship. The sensor operator shook his head slowly. Oh yeah, he said, that's definitely a ship. More giant vessels emerged behind it. 10, 20, 30, a whole fleet of them, and they were heading straight toward Earth. Inside the Dominator, Admiral Vrax stared at the screen. For the first time that day, the Krill Empire wasn't laughing anymore, because the humans had finally answered. And man, they had brought dreadnoughts. Inside the massive Krill flagship Dominator, the command room had gone completely quiet. Just a few minutes ago, the alien officers had been laughing. They had joked about how easy it would be to conquer Earth. 1 hour, maybe 2. That was their guess. Now nobody was laughing. Every eye in the room was locked on the giant holographic screen. The shapes coming toward Earth were now much clearer. Huge ships. Not just big, massive. The first one slowly moved into the light of the nearby star, and the entire room felt the tension rise. The ship looked like a floating metal mountain. Its armor was thick and layered like the shell of some ancient beast. Long, glowing blue lines ran across the hull, pulsing softly like veins of energy. Gigantic cannons were mounted along the sides. Some of them were so large they looked like entire buildings attached to the ship. One Krill officer leaned closer to his console. Sir, I'm reading insane energy levels from that vessel. Admiral Vrax frowned. How insane? The officer swallowed. Well, if those readings are correct, that ship alone has more firepower than one of our battle groups. The room fell silent again. Another officer suddenly spoke up. Wait. More ships are appearing. The hologram zoomed out. Everyone watched as more giant vessels slowly emerged from the darkness of deep space. One after another, they were arranged in formation, clean, organized, disciplined. These were not random ships drifting through space. This was a fleet, and a big one. One nervous Krill commander scratched the side of his head. Okay, real talk. Where the heck did these things come from? Another officer shook his head. Our scouts never detected anything like this before. That's because, a different commander muttered, these ships were never near Earth. Admiral Vrax narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? The officer pulled up additional data on the screen. These ships are arriving from the outer system, far beyond the orbit of Pluto. He paused, almost like they were hiding out there. Another officer leaned back in his chair. Oh man, you're telling me humans were hiding a fleet this whole time? Someone else said quietly. Yeah, and not just any fleet. The hologram zoomed in again on the leading vessel. The ship's front section slowly rotated, revealing a massive cannon stretching across the length of the hull. The weapon looked terrifying, even by Krill standards. The sensor operator wiped sweat from his forehead. Sir, that main weapon, it's a railgun. Vrax crossed his arms. Lots of ships have railguns. The operator shook his head. Not like this one. He adjusted the display. This railgun fires projectiles at near relativistic speed. One officer blinked. Hold up. Did you just say near light speed? The operator nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Another commander leaned back. Dang. That's kind of crazy. The first giant ship continued moving closer to Earth. Behind it, more dreadnoughts followed, huge shapes sliding through space like silent giants. Their engines glowed with deep blue light. Each ship looked different, but they all shared one thing in common. They were built for war. Heavy armor, massive weapons, zero. Mercy, Admiral Vrax finally spoke again. How many ships are we looking at? The sensor operator checked again. 32 confirmed so far. Another officer let out a low whistle. 32 of those monsters? Someone muttered. Yeah, that's not good. Meanwhile, down on Earth, the situation looked very different. People across the planet had also noticed the new arrivals. Astronomers were the first to see them. Then satellites picked up the signals. Within minutes, news channels began broadcasting the images. Massive human warships were moving toward Earth. At first, civilians were confused. What are those ships? Are those ours? Wait, we have ships like that? Inside military command centers across the world, leaders were staring at the screens in disbelief. One general whispered, "Where did those come from?" A scientist standing nearby smiled slightly. "They've been out there for a while." The general turned. "You knew about this?" The scientist shrugged. "Let's just say humanity likes to keep a few cards hidden." Back in space, the Krill fleet had stopped laughing completely. Thousands of alien warships floated around Earth, but now their formation looked less confident. The approaching human fleet was simply too big to ignore. Inside the Dominator, tension filled the air. Admiral Vrax watched the screen carefully. Open communication with the approaching ships. The communications officer nodded. "Yes, Admiral." A signal was sent toward the incoming fleet. Seconds passed. Then a reply appeared, but it wasn't audio. It was just a symbol, a simple human emblem glowing on the screen. A silver eagle holding a planet in its claws. One Krill officer tilted his head. "That's it?" Another officer chuckled nervously. "Well, that's kind of badass." Admiral Vrax didn't smile. He studied the emblem carefully. "Keep scanning those ships." The sensor operators continued analyzing the incoming dreadnoughts. More data started appearing. Shield strength, weapon arrays, engine power, and every new reading made the room feel heavier. One operator finally spoke again. "Admiral, I think we underestimated these humans." Another officer laughed nervously. "Yeah, just a little." The leading human ship was now close enough for full visual. Its massive name appeared painted across the side of the hull. HMS Liberty. The ship looked unstoppable. Thick armor plates overlapped each other like giant metal scales. Hundreds of gun batteries lined the sides. Hangar doors slowly opened, revealing rows of smaller fighter ships inside. One Krill officer leaned forward. "Sir, those hangars are huge." "How huge?" The officer shook his head. "Big enough to launch an entire fighter wing every minute." Someone in the back muttered, "Man, that's wild." More dreadnoughts continued appearing behind the Liberty. They formed a defensive line between Earth and the Krill fleet. It was a clear message. The humans were not hiding anymore. They were here, and they were ready. Inside the Dominator, Admiral Vrack stared at the massive ships. For the first time since entering Earth's system, he felt something strange. Doubt. He slowly turned toward his officers. "So," he said calmly, "humans claim to have no fleet." No one answered. The hologram displayed 32 enormous warships surrounding Earth. Vrax exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered, "looks like that was a bunch of bull." Behind him, one nervous officer whispered to another, "Dude, I think we just kicked the wrong door." And deep down, a lot of Krill commanders were starting to think the same thing, because the humans weren't scared anymore, not even a little. In fact, it looked like humanity had been waiting for this moment all along, and now their dreadnought fleet was finally here, ready to throw down. And trust me, things were about to get real messy. Inside the Krill flagship Dominator, the command room no longer felt like the place it had been an hour ago. Earlier, the alien officers had been joking and laughing. Now the room felt tight, heavy, uncomfortable. Everyone was staring at the massive, holographic screen floating in the center of the chamber. On that screen, 32 giant human warships had now formed a defensive wall between Earth and the Krill invasion fleet. The lead vessel, HMS Liberty, floated at the center of the formation like a king surrounded by guards. Its massive hull glowed with soft, blue energy lines. Heavy cannons slowly rotated into position. Missile bays opened. Defense turrets activated one by one. The ship looked calm, but it also looked ready. Very ready. A Krill weapons officer cleared his throat. "Admiral, the human ships are powering up." Admiral Vrack stood with his arms crossed behind his back. "How many weapons are active?" The officer checked his display again. "All of them." Another officer blinked. "All of them?" "Yep." Someone in the back muttered quietly. "Well, that's not good." The tension in the room kept rising. The sensor operators continued, scanning the human dreadnoughts. But every new scan only made things worse. One operator leaned closer to his console. "Sir, these ships are heavily armored." Vrax didn't react. "How heavily?" The operator hesitated. "Well, based on the scans, it might take our heaviest battleships several minutes of full fire just to break their outer armor." A silence followed that statement. One Krill commander whispered under his breath, "Dang, these humans built tanks." Another officer added quietly, "Flying tanks." The holographic screen zoomed in on the HMS Liberty again. Now the ship's main cannon was fully visible. It stretched almost the entire length of the vessel, a railgun so massive it looked unreal. The sensor operator swallowed. "Admiral, that weapon is charging." Vrax turned his head slowly. "Charging?" "Yes, sir." "How long until it fires?" The officer checked the readings. "We don't know." Another officer suddenly spoke up. "Wait, more ships are arriving." The hologram zoomed out again. The room went quiet. Even more massive ships were appearing from deep space. 5 more, then another 3, and another 4 behind them. The human fleet was growing. Admiral Vrax frowned. "How many now?" The operator counted carefully. 44 dreadnoughts. One commander let out a long breath. "Holy crap." Another officer rubbed his face. "Okay, this is getting ridiculous." The Krill invasion fleet was still large. Thousands of ships surrounded Earth. But something had changed. The confidence was gone. Instead, there was uncertainty. Meanwhile, down on Earth, Humans were watching everything. Military bases across the planet had locked onto the alien fleet. Radar screens glowed. Satellite images updated every second. Inside a command center in North America, a group of officers stood around a massive digital map. One of them looked up at the screen showing the Human Dreadnought Fleet. He smiled slightly. Well, guess the big boys finally showed up. Another officer nodded. Yeah, about time. A young soldier nearby stared at the screen in amazement. Sir, those ships are ours? The commander chuckled. Yep. The soldier shook his head slowly. Man, that's wild. Back in space, the tension between the two fleets kept rising. 44 human dreadnoughts now hovered in formation. Their engines glowed like small stars. Fighter launch bays slowly opened across the fleet. Hundreds of smaller craft prepared for launch. Inside the Krill flagship, the communications officer suddenly spoke. Admiral, incoming transmission. Vrax turned immediately. From the humans? Yes, sir. Put it on the main screen. The holographic display flickered. A human face appeared. It was a middle-aged woman wearing a dark military uniform. Her expression was calm. Very calm. She didn't look scared. Not even a little. Greetings, she said. My name is Admiral Sarah Mitchell of the United Earth Defense Fleet. Several Krill officers exchanged surprised looks. One whispered, Oh, they have admirals too. The human woman continued speaking. You are currently positioned in Earth's sovereign territory. Her voice remained steady. You have been ordered to leave this system immediately. The Krill officers stared in disbelief. One muttered quietly, Did she just order us to leave? Another whispered, Yeah, she totally did. Admiral Vrax stepped forward. Human commander, he said coldly. You are surrounded by the Krill, Empire's largest invasion fleet. He gestured toward the thousands of alien ships around Earth. You cannot win this battle. The human admiral tilted her head slightly. Then she smiled. Not a nervous smile. More like the smile of someone who already knew how the story would end. Well, she said casually, guess we'll find out. Several Krill officers shifted uncomfortably. Admiral, Vrax narrowed his eyes. You would risk your entire species on this fight? Admiral Mitchell shrugged slightly. Buddy, you invaded our home. She leaned a little closer to the camera. That was your first mistake. Behind her, the image briefly showed the massive Human Dreadnought Fleet, dozens of giant ships floating silently in space, weapons ready, engines glowing. She spoke again. You have exactly 5 minutes to leave the Sol system. Her voice stayed. Calm. If you do not leave. She paused. We will remove you. The screen went dark. Inside the Dominator, the room exploded with noise. Officers began shouting. That's a bluff. They can't beat us. Look at our numbers. But others were not so confident. One sensor officer whispered to his partner, Dude, those ships are scary. Another officer nodded slowly. Yeah, I got a bad feeling about this. Admiral. Vrax remained silent. He studied the human fleet carefully. 44 massive dreadnoughts, every weapon ready, every ship in perfect formation. They were not acting scared, not even a little. They were waiting, and somehow, that made the situation feel worse. One officer finally spoke quietly. Admiral, what are your orders? Vrax looked back at the hologram of Earth. The small blue planet floated peacefully behind the human fleet. Then he turned toward the approaching dreadnoughts. His voice was cold. Prepare all ships for battle. Across the Krill fleet, alarms began to sound. Thousands of alien warships powered up their weapons. Missile bays opened. Energy cannons charged. Meanwhile, across the human fleet, the dreadnoughts didn't move. They simply held their position. Calm, silent, ready. Because humanity had already made its decision. If the Krill wanted a fight, well, they were about to get one. And deep down inside the Krill command room, a lot of officers were starting to realize something. This invasion was supposed to be easy. But now it looked like they had just started a war with the wrong species, and things were about to get real crazy. The tension in space had become thick enough to almost feel. Two massive fleets faced each other near Earth. On one side were the ships of the Krill Empire, thousands of warships that had conquered worlds across the galaxy. On the other side were the ships of humanity. 44 gigantic dreadnoughts floated silently between Earth and the alien fleet. No one fired yet, but everyone knew the fight was about to begin. Inside the Krill flagship Dominator, alarms quietly blinked across every control panel. Weapons were charged, shields were active, missiles were ready. Admiral Varax stood at the center of the command deck, watching the human fleet carefully. The dreadnoughts looked calm, too calm. One of his officers spoke nervously. "Admiral, human fighters are launching." The holographic screen zoomed closer. Hundreds of small craft streamed out of the massive dreadnought hangars. They flew fast, forming tight squadrons around the giant ships. Another officer scratched his head. "Why? Launch fighters now?" A different commander answered quietly. "Probably defense." The sensor operator shook his head. "No, sir. They're forming attack groups." A long silence followed. Then one officer muttered under his breath, "Oh man, this is about to get spicy." Meanwhile, on the bridge of the HNS Liberty, Admiral Sarah Mitchell stood in front of a giant viewing screen. Beyond the glass, the Krill fleet stretched across space like a metal storm cloud. Thousands of alien ships. More than enough to scare most civilizations, but not humanity. Behind the Admiral, dozens of human officers worked at their stations. Everyone was focused. No panic, no shouting, just quiet preparation. A young officer looked up from his console. "Admiral, the Krill fleet is powering all primary weapons." Mitchell nodded calmly. "Figures." Another officer added, "Missile locks detected across multiple sectors." Mitchell folded her arms. "All right, looks like they chose option B." The weapons officer asked carefully, "Orders, ma'am." Mitchell looked out at the alien fleet. Then she gave a small smile. "Let's show them why invading Earth is a bad idea." Back on the Krill flagship, the sensor officer suddenly leaned forward. "Admiral!" Vrax turned. "What?" "The human flagship is charging its main weapon." The hologram zoomed toward the HNS Liberty. Along the front of the dreadnought, the massive railgun began to glow. Blue energy raced along the long barrel. Power readings climbed higher and higher. One Krill officer blinked. That looks serious." Another officer whispered, "Yeah, that cannon is huge." The energy readings kept climbing. Vrax spoke quickly. "All ships prepare defensive positions." Across the Krill fleet, ships began shifting formation. Heavy cruisers moved forward. Battleships activated stronger shields. Missile frigates moved to the sides. But something felt strange. The human fleet still hadn't moved. They simply waited. Like hunters watching their prey. Inside the HNS Liberty, the weapons officer spoke. "Railgun charge at 90%. Admiral Mitchell nodded. "Target?" The officer tapped his screen. "Krill battleship, center formation." A giant alien warship appeared on the display. It was one of the biggest ships in the Krill fleet. Mitchell gave a small shrug. "All right." She took a slow breath. "Fire." Outside the dreadnought, the massive railgun suddenly exploded with light. Boom! A giant metal projectile shot forward at unbelievable speed. The shot crossed space in less than a second. Inside the Krill flagship, the sensor operator barely had time to react. Impact. The giant Krill battleship suddenly vanished in a bright explosion. One moment it was there, the next moment, gone. The railgun round had punched straight through the ship's core. The entire vessel broke apart in a cloud of burning metal. Silence filled the Krill command room. One officer stared at the screen. Did that just happen?" Another officer whispered, "Yeah, that totally just happened." Admiral Vrax's eyes widened slightly. The Human Dreadnought had destroyed a battleship with a single shot. Then something even worse happened. More dreadnought railguns began glowing. Across the human fleet, giant weapons started charging. One Krill officer suddenly shouted, "Oh crap!" Another yelled, "They're all firing!" Inside the HNS Liberty, Admiral Mitchell gave a calm order. Full fleet, engage. The stars exploded with light. Dozens of massive railguns fired at once. Blue streaks of energy tore across space. Alien ships exploded left and right. One cruiser split in half. Another battleship lost its entire front section. A missile carrier burst into flames. Inside the Krill fleet, chaos erupted. Commanders began shouting over each other. Return fire, launch missiles, all ships attack. Thousands of alien weapons fired at once. Laser beams flashed through space. Missiles streaked toward the human fleet. The battle had begun. Inside the HNS Liberty, alarms blinked as enemy fire approached. The tactical officer spoke quickly. Enemy missiles incoming. Mitchell nodded. Point defense. Hundreds of small cannons across the Dreadnought opened fire. Bright tracer rounds filled space. Missiles exploded one after another before reaching the ship. A few lasers struck the Dreadnought's shields, but the shields held strong. The Liberty barely moved. Another officer looked at the screen. Ma'am, the Krill fleet is pushing forward. Mitchell smiled slightly. Good. She leaned forward. Let them come. Outside, the Human Dreadnought Fleet slowly advanced. Their engines glowed brighter. Fighter squadrons rushed toward the alien ships. Railguns fired again and again. Each shot destroyed another enemy vessel. Inside the Krill flagship, fear was starting to spread. One officer whispered, "These humans are insane." Another muttered, "They're not even backing up." Admiral Vrax stared at the battle unfolding in front of him. The invasion fleet was taking damage faster than expected, much faster. And the humans were only getting started. For the first time since the invasion began, the Krill Empire realized something terrifying. This fight was not going to be easy, not even close, because humanity had finally shown its true strength. And man, the humans were bringing some serious heat. Space around Earth had turned into complete chaos. Explosions flashed across the darkness like violent fireworks. Burning pieces of alien ships drifted through the battlefield. The Krill invasion fleet, once proud and confident, was now fighting for survival. Human dreadnoughts moved forward slowly but steadily, like giant metal giants marching through a storm. Every time their massive railguns fired, another Krill ship vanished in a bright flash. Inside the Krill flagship Dominator, the command room was filled with shouting. Officers were running between stations. Warning lights blinked everywhere. One sensor officer yelled across the room, "Admiral, we've lost 37 ships." Another officer shouted, "Enemy fighters are attacking our outer lines." Admiral Vrax clenched his fists. Just an hour ago, this invasion had seemed like easy money. Now it was turning into a nightmare. On the main screen, the Human Dreadnought HNS Liberty continued moving forward. The giant ship looked unstoppable. Every weapon on its hull was firing. Railguns thundered, missile launchers roared, defense cannons shredded incoming threats. One Krill officer whispered nervously, "That ship is a monster." Another officer nodded, "Yeah, humans built a beast." Meanwhile, inside the HNS Liberty, the mood was very different. The human bridge was calm and organized. Officers worked quickly but smoothly. No panic, no chaos, just focused action. Admiral Sarah Mitchell stood in front of the command screen watching the battle unfold. Alien ships were breaking formation everywhere. The Krill fleet had expected an easy invasion. They had not expected a full-scale war. A young officer looked up from his console. "Admiral, enemy cruisers are trying to flank our left side." Mitchell nodded. "Send the Atlanta group to intercept." The officer responded immediately. "Yes, ma'am." Several human dreadnoughts changed course slightly. Their engines glowed brighter as they moved to block the approaching alien ships. Behind them, hundreds of human fighter craft rushed forward like angry hornets. Inside the Krill fleet, the panic was getting worse. A cruiser captain shouted into his comm system, "We're surrounded by human fighters." Missiles slammed into the cruisers. Hull explosions rocked the ship. Another captain yelled, "We need backup." But backup was becoming hard to find. Human dreadnoughts kept pushing forward. Their heavy armor absorbed most of the alien attacks. Their shields shimmered under enemy fire but held strong. One Krill officer stared at the damage reports. "This is insane," he muttered. "Our weapons barely scratch them." Another officer whispered. Humans didn't just build ships. He looked at the battle again. They built fortresses. Back on the human flagship, the tactical officer suddenly spoke. Admiral, new targets locked. The screen zoomed in on a large group of alien ships trying to regroup. Battleships, missile carriers, support vessels. Mitchell nodded slowly. Well, let's break up their little party. She gave the order. All dreadnoughts. Full volley. Across the human fleet, giant railguns began charging again. Blue energy lines flashed across the hulls of the massive ships. Then, boom! Dozens of railguns fired at the same time. Huge metal projectiles tore across space. The results were devastating. 3 Krill battleships exploded instantly. A missile carrier shattered into pieces. 2 cruisers spun out of control, their engines destroyed. Inside the Dominator, the bridge crew watched the destruction in shock. One officer slammed his hand on the console. Admiral, we're losing ships too fast. Another officer shouted. Our front line is collapsing. Admiral Vrack stared at the battle silently. The humans were not just defending Earth. They were crushing the invasion. Then a loud alarm sounded across the command room. A sensor operator shouted, Admiral, human dreadnoughts are surrounding our position. The hologram zoomed out again. The human fleet had spread out across the battlefield. Their massive ships now formed a giant circle around much of the Krill fleet. One officer whispered nervously, Oh man, they're boxing us in. Another muttered, This is bad. Real bad. Meanwhile, human fighters continued attacking alien ships, small but deadly, fast and aggressive. Missiles struck alien engines, laser cannons ripped through exposed hulls. The fighters moved like a swarm of angry wasps. Inside the HNS. Liberty, the weapons officer, spoke again. Admiral, enemy formation is breaking apart. Mitchell nodded. Yeah, I can see that. The tactical screen showed Krill ships retreating in multiple directions. Some were damaged. Some were burning. Some were simply running. One human officer grinned. Looks like they're losing their nerve. Mitchell crossed her arms. Well, invading someone's home tends to do that. Suddenly, another officer spoke. Admiral, the Krill flagship is pulling back. The screen zoomed toward the Dominator. The massive alien command ship had started moving away from the main battle. Mitchell raised an eyebrow. Trying to bail out already? Another officer chuckled. Guess they don't want the smoke anymore. But the battle wasn't over yet. Human dreadnoughts kept advancing. Every minute, more alien ships were destroyed or disabled. The Krill invasion fleet was slowly falling. Apart inside the Dominator, Admiral Vrax finally spoke. His voice was low and tense. All ships, prepare emergency retreat. Several officers looked shocked. Admiral, we're leaving? Vrax stared at the battlefield. His once powerful fleet was now scattered and burning. The humans had turned the invasion into a disaster. Yes, he said quietly. We are leaving. One officer whispered, This was supposed to be an easy win. Another officer shook his head slowly. Yeah, but we messed with the wrong planet. Outside, the human dreadnoughts continued moving forward, like unstoppable giants. The Krill fleet had started the war, but humanity was about to finish it. And across the battlefield, one thing had become very clear. The galaxy had made a huge mistake, because humans were not weak, they were not defenseless, and when someone threatened their home, they didn't just fight back, they unleashed absolute hell. And trust me, the galaxy was finally starting to understand that. The hard way. The battlefield around Earth was no longer a clean formation of ships. It was a graveyard. Broken pieces of alien warships drifted slowly through space. Some were still burning. Others were silent and dark, floating forever in the cold vacuum. The once massive Krill invasion fleet had been shattered. Human dreadnoughts now controlled the battlefield. Their giant armored hulls moved slowly through space like guardians protecting their home. Fighter squadrons patrolled the area, chasing down the last enemy ships trying to escape. The invasion that was supposed to conquer Earth had turned into one of the worst defeats the Krill Empire had ever suffered. Inside the Krill flagship Dominator, the mood was dark. completely different from the confident laughter that had filled the room earlier. Now the bridge was filled with silence and fear. Warning lights still blinked across the control panels. Half of the fleet icons on the tactical screen were gone, destroyed. Admiral Vrack stood motionless in front of the holographic display. He watched as another Krill cruiser exploded under the fire of a human railgun. One of his officers spoke quietly. "Admiral, we have lost over 60% of the fleet." Another officer added nervously, "Human ships are blocking most escape routes." A third officer whispered, "Sir, we may not get out of this system." For the first time in his long military career, Admiral Vrax felt something he had never expected. Regret. Not fear, not panic. Just the cold realization that he had made a terrible mistake. Invading Earth had seemed easy, but now the truth was impossible to ignore. Humanity had been hiding its strength, and the Krill Empire had walked straight into the trap. Back on the HNS Liberty, Admiral Sarah Mitchell watched the same battlefield from her command screen. Her officers stood around her, tracking enemy ships and organizing the remaining human forces. The battle was almost over. A young officer spoke first. "Admiral, the Krill flagship is attempting to escape the system." Mitchell looked at the screen. The massive alien ship Dominator was slowly turning away from the battlefield. Several damaged Krill ships were following it. Another officer raised an eyebrow. "Looks like they're running." Someone behind him muttered, "Yeah, they're booking it." Mitchell stayed calm. "Open a channel." The communications officer nodded. "Yes, ma'am." A signal shot across space toward the retreating flagship. Inside the Dominator, the communication officer looked up suddenly. "Admiral, incoming transmission from the human fleet." Vrax turned slowly. "Put it on." The holographic screen flickered to life again. Admiral Sarah Mitchell appeared. She looked exactly the same as before. Calm, confident, like someone who had already won. "Admiral Vrax," she said clearly, "we see you're leaving." Vrax stared at her. "You have proven your strength, human." His voice was tight but controlled. Mitchell nodded slightly. "Well, yeah." She crossed her arms. "Invading our home usually gets people into trouble." Several Krill officers shifted uncomfortably. Vrax spoke again. "This battle is not over." Mitchell smiled a little. "Oh, we know." She leaned forward slightly. "But today?" She pointed behind her toward the massive human fleet. "Today you lost." Silence filled the Dominator's command room. Vrax looked down at the tactical screen again. More Krill ships were being destroyed every minute. He knew she was right. Continuing the fight would only lead to more losses. Finally, he spoke quietly. "All remaining Krill forces will withdraw from this system." Mitchell nodded once. "Good choice." But then her expression became serious. "Listen carefully." Her voice carried the weight of someone speaking for an entire planet. "Earth is not your territory. Earth is not your colony. Earth is not your target." She paused for a moment. Then she finished the message. "Earth is our home." Behind her, the massive Dreadnought Fleet glowed against the stars. "Come back here again," she said calmly. "And next time, we won't let you leave." The transmission ended. Inside the Dominator, no one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Vrax gave the order. "All ships, retreat." The surviving Krill vessels activated their jump drives. One by one, they disappeared into hyperspace. Within minutes, the battlefield around Earth became quiet again. The invasion was over. The war had lasted less than 2 hours, but the message it sent would travel across the galaxy for generations. Back on Earth, millions of people watched the final moments of the battle through satellites and news feeds. When the last alien ship disappeared, celebrations erupted across the planet. Cities cheered, people hugged each other, cars honked. Someone on a news channel shouted, "Humanity just defended Earth from a full alien invasion." A soldier watching the broadcast laughed and said, "Man, that was wild." In orbit above the planet, the Human Dreadnought Fleet slowly moved into protective positions. The giant ships formed a silent shield around Earth. Admiral Mitchell stood on the bridge of the HNS Liberty, looking down at the blue world below. 1. of her officers spoke softly. "Do you think they'll come back?" Mitchell thought for a moment. Then she shrugged. "Maybe." She looked at the massive fleet surrounding the planet. Dozens of dreadnoughts, hundreds of fighters, thousands of human defenders. "If they do," she said with a small smile, "we'll be ready, far away in deep space." The retreating Krill fleet jumped from system to system. The surviving commanders carried the same message everywhere they went. A warning, a story, a lesson. The galaxy had believed Earth was weak, defenseless, easy to conquer. But now everyone knew the truth. Humanity had been quiet. Humanity had been patient. But when their home was threatened, they revealed the power they had been hiding all along. And from that day forward, every empire in the galaxy remembered one very important rule. You could challenge many species, you could conquer many worlds. But if you messed with Earth, you better be ready to face the dreadnoughts of humanity. Because humans didn't just defend their home, they protected it like absolute legends.